Margaret Chen had been married to David for 23 years, and she knew every expression that crossed his weathered face, every sigh that escaped his lips, every shade of sadness and joy that colored his eyes, or at least, she thought she did, until 3 months ago when her husband started waking before dawn and returning home with a smile she had never seen before, a smile so peaceful and mysterious that it made her stomach twist with a feeling she couldn't quite name, something between curiosity and fear, something that whispered he was keeping a secret that could either break her heart or change everything she thought she knew about the man she loved. It started on a Tuesday in late September, the kind of morning when the air carried the first honest chill of autumn and the leaves outside their bedroom window had just begun to surrender their green, and Margaret had rolled over at 5:30 to find David's side of the bed empty, the sheets cool to the touch, as if he had been gone for hours, and when she padded downstairs in her robe, she found him coming through the front door with that strange, radiant expression, his eyes distant yet somehow more alive than she had seen them in years, and when she asked where he had been, he simply kissed her forehead and said, "Just needed some fresh air, Maggie, nothing to worry about." But she was worried, because in 23 years, David Chen had never been a morning person, had never voluntarily left his bed before the alarm clock forced him out, and here he was now, rising before the sun with the dedication of a man on a mission he refused to share. Margaret and David had built what most people would call a good life, a modest 2-story house in the suburbs of Riverside, 2 children who had grown and gone to build their own lives, stable careers that paid the bills without demanding their souls, neighbors who waved from across trimmed lawns, in the kind of comfortable routine that can feel like safety or suffocation depending on the day. But lately, somewhere in the space between their shared dinners and their separate evening activities, Margaret had felt a distance growing, a silence that filled the rooms, even when they were talking, and she had blamed it on the empty nest, on the natural drift that comes when children leave and couples must remember who they were before they became parents. But now she wondered if there was something more, something David was hiding, something that made him smile like that when he thought she wasn't watching. For weeks, she said nothing, choosing instead to observe, to catalog the clues like a detective in her own home, the way he would check his phone and immediately look away, the mud on his shoes that suggested walking through grass, the faint scent of something antiseptic that clung to his clothes, the way he hummed old songs under his breath, songs she recognized from the cassette tapes his father used to play when they first started dating, songs she hadn't heard him hum in over a decade, and with each passing day, her imagination grew darker, painting scenarios she was ashamed to even consider, until one October morning, when the sky was just beginning to blush with the first light of dawn, Margaret Chen made a decision that would change her life forever. She was going to follow her husband and discover the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. She waited until she heard the familiar creak of the 3rd stair, the soft click of the front door, the muffled sound of his car engine fading down the street, and then she threw on jeans and a sweater, grabbed her keys with trembling hands, and followed at a careful distance, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that she almost missed the turn he took onto Oak Street, then another onto Maple Avenue, past the coffee shop where they had their first date, past the park where their children learned to ride bicycles, past the boundaries of their familiar life, into a part of town she rarely visited, a quiet neighborhood of older homes and towering oak trees that eventually gave way to a building she had driven past 1,000 times without ever really seeing. Sunrise Haven Nursing Home, a modest brick structure with flower boxes in the windows and a sign that promised compassionate care for your loved ones, and Margaret watched in confusion as her husband pulled into the parking lot, stepped out of his car, and walked through the front doors as if he had done it 1,000 times before. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, her mind racing through possibilities, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, because they had no family in this nursing home, no friends that she knew of, No reason for David to be here at 6 in the morning with that strange, peaceful smile on his face. And finally, driven by a need to understand that was stronger than her fear of what she might find, Margaret stepped out of her car and walked toward the entrance, her legs unsteady, her breath catching in her throat. And when she stepped through the automatic doors into a lobby that smelled of lavender and lemon cleaner, she was greeted by a young woman at the reception desk who looked up with a warm smile and asked if she could help. And Margaret heard herself say, in a voice that didn't quite sound like her own, "I'm looking for my husband, David Chen. I believe he comes here in the mornings." And the young woman's face lit up with recognition as she said, "Oh, you must be Harold's friend's wife." "Yes, Mr. Chen is in room 214, same as always. He never misses a morning with Harold. It's really the sweetest thing, you know? Harold doesn't get any other visitors, and your husband has been like a son to him. Just go down the hall and take a left. You'll hear them before you see them." Margaret walked down the hallway in a daze, past rooms where elderly residents sat in wheelchairs or lay in beds surrounded by photographs of lives fully lived, past nurses who nodded and smiled as if they knew her, past a bulletin board covered with activity schedules and hand-drawn cards from local school children, until she heard something that made her stop in her tracks, her husband's voice, reading aloud the words of what sounded like an old adventure novel, his tone animated and theatrical in a way she hadn't heard since he used to read bedtime stories to their children. And then another voice, thin and reedy with age, but filled with childlike delight, interrupting to say, "And then what happens, David? Does the captain find the treasure?" Margaret peered around the doorframe of room 214 and saw a scene that made her hand fly to her mouth to stifle a sob. Her husband sitting beside a hospital bed, holding an old hardcover book in one hand and the weathered hand of an elderly man in the other. The old man's face gaunt and pale but animated with joy, his eyes, clouded with age, fixed on David with an expression of pure trust and affection. And David, her David, the man who had seemed so distant and distracted for months, looking at this stranger with a tenderness that took her breath away, continuing the story with theatrical flourishes, making the old man laugh, squeezing his hand gently, being present in a way she hadn't seen him be present with anyone in years. She stood there for what felt like hours, watching this secret life her husband had built, watching him help the old man drink water from a cup, watching him adjust the pillows, watching him laugh at jokes she couldn't hear. And she understood nothing and everything all at once, because this was clearly not what she had feared. Not betrayal, not deception, but something else entirely. Something beautiful and mysterious and somehow unbearably sad, and she needed to understand. Needed to know why her husband had been giving his mornings to a stranger in a nursing home while telling her he was just getting fresh air. So she finally stepped through the doorway, her eyes wet with tears she couldn't explain. And David looked up and saw her, and for one long moment, they simply stared at each other across the room, across the distance that had grown between them, across 23 years of shared history, and the 3 months of secrets that had brought them to this moment. And David's face went through a journey of emotions, surprise, then fear, then something that looked like relief, before he finally spoke, his voice thick with feeling. "Maggie, I wanted to tell you, I just didn't know how." The story came out slowly, haltingly, as Harold dozed peacefully in his bed, and David led Margaret to a small sitting area down the hall, where families could have private conversations, and he told her things she had never known, secrets he had carried for decades, beginning with the truth about his father, Chen Wei, who had died of heart failure 7 years ago, a death that David had never fully grieved because he and his father had been estranged for the last 3 years of the old man's life, separated by a stupid argument about David's career choices, about money, about all the things that seemed so important in the moment and so meaningless in the face of death. And when David had finally decided to reach out, to pick up the phone and say he was sorry, it was too late. His father was already gone, buried in a cemetery 3 states away, before David even knew he was sick. And David had carried that guilt, that regret, that unfinished grief like a stone in his chest ever since, never talking about it, never letting it out, just pushing it down and moving forward because that's what he thought he was supposed to do, until 3 months ago, when he was passing by Sunrise Haven, on his way to a client meeting, and saw an elderly Chinese man sitting alone in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at the parking lot with an expression of such profound loneliness that David had to pull over, had to stop, had to go inside and ask if anyone ever visited that man. And the answer had broken his heart. Harold Chen, no relation, just a coincidence that felt like fate. 91 years old, a former teacher with no living family, suffering from early dementia that made him forget where he was, but somehow always remember the important things, like kindness, like stories, like the feeling of someone holding his hand. And David had started coming every morning, just for a few minutes at first, then longer and longer, because being there for Harold felt like the second chance he never got with his own father, a chance to be present, to be patient, to be the son he wished he had been. And every smile Harold gave him, every laugh, every moment of connection, lifted a piece of the guilt he had carried for so long. And he hadn't told Margaret, because he hadn't known how to explain it, hadn't known how to open the door to all that pain and shame and regret without falling apart completely. And he was afraid, so afraid, that she would think he was foolish, or broken, or spending time with a stranger, instead of fixing what was wrong in his own home. But the truth was that fixing Harold was teaching him how to fix himself. And he was almost ready to come home fully, to be present with her the way he was learning to be present with this kind old man who called him son, and told him stories about teaching history to high schoolers in 1965, and asked every single day, with genuine curiosity, "And who are you again, young man?" as if meeting him for the first time, which somehow made it hurt more and heal more at the same time. Margaret listened to all of this with tears streaming down her face, reaching for her husband's hands across the small table, understanding finally the distance she had felt, understanding that it wasn't about her, wasn't about their marriage, but about a wound David had been carrying alone for far too long. A wound she wished he had let her help him heal. And she told him so, told him that she had been afraid, that she had imagined the worst, that she had followed him this morning, prepared to have her heart broken, and instead found it breaking open in an entirely different way. And David said, "I'm so sorry I shut you out, Maggie. I'm so sorry I didn't trust you with this. I thought I had to fix myself alone. But that's not how it works, is it?" And she said, "No, that's not how it works. We fix each other. That's what 23 years means." And they sat there in the hallway of that nursing home, holding hands and crying and laughing and finally talking about the things that mattered, the things they had been too busy or too scared to say, until a nurse appeared and said, gently, "Mr. Chen, Harold's awake again and asking for you." And David looked at Margaret with a question in his eyes, and she smiled through her tears and said, "Well, aren't you going to introduce me to your friend?" The weeks that followed transformed the Chun's life in ways Margaret never could have imagined, because she started coming with David on his morning visits, bringing flowers for Harold's room and pastries from the bakery down the street, and Harold would look at them with that beautiful, foggy confusion and say, "What a lovely couple. Remind me how we know each other." And David would patiently explain, every single time, without a trace of frustration, and Margaret would watch her husband and fall in love with him all over again. With this man she thought she knew completely, who had turned out to have depths she had never explored. And she thought about her own parents, both still alive and living in Florida, both just a phone call away, both deserving of more calls than she made, more visits than she planned, more presents than she gave, and she started calling them every day, started planning a trip for Thanksgiving, started saying I love you at the end of every conversation, as if it might be the last, because David had taught her, through Harold, that it might be, that nothing is promised, that the things we put off become the regrets we carry forever. Harold's condition worsened as autumn turned to winter, his lucid moments becoming rarer, his body growing frailer, but his face still lit up every morning when David walked through the door, some part of him, deeper than memory, recognizing the feeling of being loved, and the nursing staff told Margaret that Harold was a different person now than he had been before David started visiting, more peaceful, more joyful, less afraid of the darkness that was slowly closing in. And one December morning, 3 days before Christmas, Margaret and David arrived at room 214 to find Harold propped up in bed, more alert than he had been in weeks, his eyes clear and focused, and he looked at David for a long moment before saying, in a voice stronger than it had been in months, I know you're not my son. You know, I've known for a while. My son died in Vietnam in 1969, but you remind me so much of him. The kindness in your eyes, the way you read to me, the way you hold my hand like it matters, and I want you to know that whatever brought you here, whoever you're really doing this for, you saved me from dying alone, and that's a gift I can never repay, so I'm giving you something instead. I'm giving you permission to forgive yourself for whatever you're carrying, because I can see it, the guilt, the regret, and I need you to know that it's okay. You're a good man, David, your father, wherever he is. He knows it too. And David broke down sobbing, really sobbing, in a way Margaret had never seen in all their years together. And she held him while Harold smiled peacefully and closed his eyes. And 3 days later, on Christmas morning, Harold passed away in his sleep with a photograph of David and Margaret on his nightstand, the first family photo that had graced that room in decades. The funeral was small, just Margaret and David, a few nurses from the home, and Harold's longtime lawyer who had come to handle the estate, but it was beautiful, held in a small chapel with sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. And David gave a eulogy that made everyone cry, speaking about second chances and unexpected connections and the way love can transcend memory and blood, about an old man who taught a middle-aged accountant how to grieve his father and how to open his heart to his wife and how to understand that we are all connected, all capable of healing each other if we're brave enough to show up, to be present, to say the things that matter before it's too late. And after the service, the lawyer approached them with an envelope, explaining that Harold had no family to leave his modest savings to and had recently amended his will, leaving everything to David Chen, the son who chose me, along with a handwritten letter that said simply, build something beautiful with this, something that connects people who feel alone. That's all I ever wanted. Thank you for showing me that strangers can become family. With love, Harold. They used the money to start a volunteer program at Sunrise Haven, matching lonely residents with community members who had time and love to give, calling it Harold's Circle, and within a year, it had expanded to 4 nursing homes in the county, with a waiting list of volunteers eager to be matched with someone who needed them. And Margaret and David ran it together, side by side. Their marriage transformed by a secret that had almost driven them apart but instead had brought them closer than ever before, teaching them that the things we hide from each other often aren't shameful at all, but sacred. Wounds that need witness, grief that needs company, love that needs an outlet. And now, every morning, they wake before dawn together, not because they have to, but because they want to, driving to different nursing homes, reading stories to residents who have no one else, holding hands that haven't been held in months or years, listening to memories that might otherwise be lost forever, and sometimes, when the light comes through the window, just right, and an old man laughs at a joke or an elderly woman squeezes her hand with surprising strength, Margaret looks at her husband and sees that smile, that peaceful, mysterious, radiant smile that once made her stomach twist with worry, and now she smiles it too, because she finally understands what it means. It's the smile of someone who has found a way to turn regret into purpose, to turn grief into giving, to turn the mistakes of the past into the mercy of the present. And if that's not a reason to smile, nothing is. Years later, when people asked Margaret how she and David had managed to stay so in love after so many years together, she would think of Harold, of that December morning when a dying man gave her husband permission to forgive himself, and she would say, simply, "We learned that the things that could tear us apart can also be the things that make us whole. We just have to be brave enough to follow each other into the dark places and stay there until the light comes back. Because that's what love is, isn't it? Not running from each other's pain, but running toward it, holding hands, and trusting that together, we can find our way through." And in her heart, she would add silently, "Thank you, Harold, for giving me my husband back, for teaching us that it's never too late to start over, and for proving that sometimes the strangers who walk into our lives are exactly the family we didn't know we needed."